Morning, good afternoon, and maybe good evening to some of you. um, we're just going to wait a second for as people start to trickle in and making sure that we get started. But thank you so much for joining us, whatever time it is for you. All right, so now that we're at 100, I feel good. Um, um, Thank you for everyone for joining us. This is a really exciting moment for structural reform and ranked choice voting. I appreciate you spending the hour with us. FairVote has been conducting a series of virtual panels on the future of American elections. There isn't a more timely topic, and we have been talking with some of the most visionary thinkers in electoral reform about how we create the kind of democracy that lives up to our highest ideals and helps allow for the kind of politics and leadership we need during this especially challenging time. This is our sixth conversation, and you can find our other five on our YouTube channel. We want you to be involved today. I'll post the first set of questions, and then we'll open it up. If you have questions you'd like to ask, please use the Q&A and chat functions you'll see on Zoom, and you can go ahead and leave those at any time. Our FairVote team will monitor those, and then we'll give them to me throughout the conversation. We're excited to be speaking today with three guests about Maine's first use of ranked choice voting in the general presidential election. Ranked choice voting has received support across the political spectrum, the Greens, the Libertarian, to Democratic and Republican support. During a time when our country is deeply divided and even conversations about voting and democracy often have a partisan edge, Fair Vote, as well as our allies across the country, have been advocating for reform that can unite us and create a better path towards ensuring voters have more voice and more choice. I'm grateful for today's guests, Carrie, Anna, and Marc, are principled, courageous, and visionary. Their leadership on these issues is so important, and if we're going to come together around reforms to make representation better for everybody and fix the system during these such polarizing times, it's really important that we have conversations like these. So I can introduce them more formally. Um, uh, Carrie LeVan, assistant professor of government at Colby College. Carrie is a Montgomery family assistant professor of government at Colby College. She's an expert on voter mobilization and social networks and their role in affecting the participation of individuals from varying social, economic, and racial and ethnic backgrounds. Her recent journal publication titled Neighborhoods That Matter: How Place and People Affect Political Participation is part of a larger project that examines the relationship between neighborhood characteristics and civic engagement. Anna Kellar is executive director of the League of Women Voters of Maine. Anna um, is also part of Maine Citizens for Clean Elections and led the Maine Uses Ranked Choice Voting education effort for Maine's first statewide RCV elections in 2018. They also managed a campaign to expand RCV to Portland, Maine municipal elections that passed with more than 80% of the vote. Utah State Representative Marc Roberts was Utah's youngest legislator when elected in November at the age of 31, and after 8 years of service, is generally considered one of the most conservative members of the Utah legislature. He currently serves as the chair of the Government Operations Committee for the Utah House of Representatives, which, among other things, has the responsibility to oversee elections. He has been a longtime advocate for ranked choice voting and spearheaded legislation to make it an option at the municipal level. So thank you so much for joining us. We can have a virtual applause there. So let's just get started. And Anna, let's begin with you. You have been an advocate for ranked choice voting in Maine, where the state has twice voted on the reform, and the Fair Elections Portland, and with the Fair Elections Portland, worked to bring ranked choice voting to the municipal level. This year was the first time Maine used ranked choice voting to select its presidential electors. What are some of your observations this election period? What are some of the expectations for the future of RCV in Maine, both locally and on the state level?
Hey, thanks. It's great to be here with FairVote and with this great panel. We went into the election in Maine, like most states, primarily focused on how we were going to manage elections through COVID and how we were going to make sure that people were still able to turn out, that our elections were trusted, and that the results were going to be clear. And so for us, as we were looking at RCV, it became really important to make sure that people who were going to be voting for the first time this year really understood how to use ranked choice voting, how it would impact their votes in not only the presidential race, where we were using it for the first time ever, but also in our Senate, US Senate race, where we had 4 candidates and we're using ranked choice voting, and in the municipal elections in Portland, where we were using it for city council and school board for the first time. And even though Mainers have voted on ranked choice voting twice before, and we have had now, we'd already had a full cycle in the midterms under our belts, there are a lot of people who only turn out to vote in presidential elections. We were hearing from people who were voting for the first time or the first time in many years in this election. And so making sure that they knew what they were doing was our top concern. And just so that folks know what happened with this election, we ended up with majority winners on the first round in both our Senate race and in our presidential race. And Maine has the strange quirk, like only Maine and Nebraska, of dividing our electoral votes. So we give 2 votes to the winner of the whole state, and then 1 vote each to the winner of our 1st and 2nd congressional district. And so we knew that there was a chance that the 2nd congressional district, which went for President Trump in 2016, was going to be very, very close this time around. And so there was what we thought was the most likely option was going to be that it would end up going to a ranked choice count. In reality, it ended up going strongly enough to President Trump on the first round that we didn't end up needing to go to the ranked choice count. And then conversely, in our 1st district, went strong enough to Joe Biden that we didn't end up needing it in that count either. And then the state overall went strongly enough to Biden. So admittedly, a little disappointing. We were ready to have the ranked choice process. We were also ready for that process to be heavily scrutinized, heavily contested, potentially, if it ended up making a difference, especially to the overall presidential election or composition of the Senate. And so disappointed to see that we didn't go through the full process this time around, but also a little bit relieved that in the end, this first use of ranked choice voting ended up being a little bit of a it was not earth-shaking in the sense that our elections went well. We had observers from the League of Women Voters in 183 of Maine's 500 polling places. We do it town by town in Maine, so every little town has its own polling place, but we were all over the state in big and little towns, and we found that there were almost no problems in the elections. Overall, voters typically reported having a really strong and satisfactory voting experience, lots of early voting. And one thing that we did here, both in terms of the presidential election, the Senate race, and in Portland's local elections, is that voters who were voting early absentee really appreciated that that was giving them extra time to look at all of the candidates on the ballot, do a little bit of research about who were these third-party candidates that this time they could actually think more about whether they wanted to vote for. Did they want to think about how to rank their second and third choice for the school board as well as their friend who was running and they were definitely going to put first? And so we heard a lot of positive responses from voters about how the process of voting and the information that they were looking for was actually better when they had this ranked choice process and they were having a little extra time with our month-long voting process with absentee voting.
Yeah, we had a similar experience out in the Bay Area. All voters in San Francisco got a vote by mail ballot, and we saw rankings as high as ever, which was very encouraging and a very, very low error rate, which is, I mean, not a surprise to me, not a surprise to its supporters, knowing that we had a new ballot design as well. But ranked choice voting elections going smoothly, non-controversial. Who knew? Anyway, I do want to get to Professor LeVan, and thank you, Anna. That was really insightful. Last year, Professor LeVan, you had an op-ed in the Bangor Daily News titled, "What Mainers Really Think of Ranked Choice Voting." In there, you write, because ranked choice voting has become a partisan issue, simply asking Maine's voters whether they want to expand it seems to be missing the point. And if we want to disentangle partisan framing of ranked choice voting and get to the heart of the matter, we need to ask voters their views of the majority requirement. Tell us what you meant here. Why should we be asking voters what they think of a majority requirement?
Yeah, thank you guys so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. So I think the best way to answer this question is to start by explaining what we know about how voters develop their preferences and their public opinions. The sort of broad misconception is that most voters come to a conclusion about a policy or a law or a new rule change like ranked choice voting by gathering a whole bunch of information and learning what the rule is and what are weighing the pros and the cons and then coming to a really informed decision. But in general, that's not how most Americans come to determine their opinion on any given policy. Instead, most people use what are called information shortcuts. So, they're rational and they know that it's really costly to go out and gather all this information. It requires a certain amount of skills and maybe some resources to be able to have access to those information. So instead, most voters rely on information shortcuts. And the most common information shortcut is partisanship. So they listen to what their party leaders tell them, and that gives them this really sort of fast track to, oh, this is what I should think too. So in the state of Maine, Democratic leadership was really sending cues to the Democratic base saying, yeah, this is a really great way to, equalize voting or ensure that we have a majority rule, and it won't, quote unquote, waste votes for voters who cast a vote for an independent candidate. And that was sort of the message that the Democratic base was getting. And then on the other end of the extreme, Republicans were sort of casting doubt about the system, saying that it was overly complicated, that it was a Democratic ploy to win elections and steal them unfairly from Republicans, et cetera. And so the Republican base really came to believe that ranked choice voting itself was something that was really insidious and bad, and it was bad for democracy for that reason, because the two bases were using these information shortcuts. But fundamentally, what is ranked choice voting? It is essentially creating a majority rule, right? It mandates that a candidate must win 50% plus one of the vote. And there are different ways we can, institute a majority rule. You can have a runoff like what's happening in Georgia right now, where if no one gets a majority, then we have to do it all over again and spend a whole bunch of money. Or we can have ranked choice voting where essentially you're doing the runoff right there at the same time. So if you can remove that partisan framing, right? So ranked choice voting was now politicized in the sense that people couldn't separate their feelings about ranked choice voting from their feelings about the parties. And so if you can remove the partisan framing and sort of focus in on the actual value or the actual thing that ranked choice voting was doing and remove that signal, that cue, you could really get into whether or not people at the core supported what ranked choice voting was doing, which was the majority rule. And so once you start asking questions, removing that partisan framing, you get a little bit more into what voters or Mainers in particular really thought about this rule. Another example, just to help understand what I'm trying to describe, is something like Obamacare, where if we just ask people, what do you think about Obamacare? Well, all Democrats are going to say, I love it. And all Republicans are going to say, I don't like it. And that's because that's the signals they've gotten. But if we ask people, what do you think about the mandate? Do you think government should force us to buy insurance? You'll have a lot more Democrats who say, I don't like the mandate. And if you ask about pre-existing conditions, you'll have a lot of Republicans who like, oh, I really like protections for pre-existing conditions. But you've sort of removed the partisan lens, the partisan framing, and you're sort of getting a little bit more into the meat and potatoes, what the law actually does. And so that's really what I was speaking to when I wrote that.
Yeah, I think that that makes a lot of sense, right? What we ask of voters sometimes in polls tends to be like a push poll, or tends to be very much like to heighten kind of partisan edges rather than trying to get to the heart of the issue, which is like, what is your view on democracy and what do you think we should be expecting of democracy as well, rather than getting into something that people perceive as a partisan issue. And I want to get to you, Representative Roberts. You approach this from a conservative lens, and you have also pioneered ranked choice voting in what people perceive as a very Republican state. In 2018, you sponsored a bill that would allow local government to conduct nonpartisan races with ranked choice voting. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and what is it about ranked choice voting that appeals to you?
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me on again. So first, what is it about RCV that appeals to me? I think for me, when I was first introduced to this, our Republican caucuses in Utah have been using RCV for quite a while, believe it or not. And that's where I was introduced to it. And rather than sit around and wait for hours for multiple rounds, of people running for, at convention and different things, and within our caucus meetings, running for delegate positions and different things. We just did ranked choice voting. You ranked everybody and you just, ranked them by your preference, and we tabulated it that way. And that was my first introduction to it. And I loved it. And then the second part about it for me was how I perceived that it eliminated vote splitting. I hate vote splitting, right? And I hate getting in this situation where people don't really vote for who they want. Most people are voting against somebody because they're more worried about that person winning. They may or may not really like the person who they're voting for, but they really don't like the other person. But maybe they like this third person down here, but they are afraid that if they vote for that person, then that's really throwing away their vote, and it's it's going to help get this other person they don't really like elected. I really love that aspect about it. And then an interesting thing happened in Utah. We had an initiative that passed in 2013 or 14, I can't remember exactly, that changed our primary elections. Prior to that, our primary elections, in order to get to a primary, you had to come out of our conventions, whether it's Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, whatever. The conventions nominated, and if you didn't get, for example, more than 60%, some places 70%, I think, in Republican conventions, then you got sent to a primary. But if you got above that, you didn't have to do a primary. And they would only ever send top 2 people to the primary. So we never had a plurality issue in our primaries. There's only ever 2 people in a primary. Well, this initiative that passed made it possible for people to collect signatures to get on the primary ballot and bypass the caucus convention system that we have here. So now all of a sudden you've got 3, 4, 5 people potentially on the primary ballot. And a number of people saw that as an issue. And so when I saw this happen, I'd always been in favor of ranked choice voting. I've been trying to figure out, how do I get this implemented, right, at the state level in different places, besides just being used at the caucus. And I saw that as a perfect opening. I'm like, here we go, right? Here's a situation now where we have this plurality issue, and people can understand the concerns with that. I'm going to run a bill. So I ran a bill 2015 maybe, that actually implemented ranked choice voting across the board at every level, right? And pretty much the clerks killed it. They said, this is going to cost millions of dollars. Nobody understands how to do this. Voters are going to be disenfranchised, and they killed it. And so that started my process of, year after year, going back to the well. All right, how can we do this? How can we shift it? How can we change it? How can I get more support to where finally, 1 year Representative Chavez Houck, who's a Democrat, I saw that she had the bill filed, and I'm like, hey, why don't you run it this year, right? And we'll just kind of tag team this together, bipartisan. So she ran it that year, and it would have implemented ranked choice voting across the board at every level, clear through the general election. That passed through the House. We got it to a Senate committee, and it died by 1 vote in the Senate committee. So we're pretty excited about that. But still, our biggest obstacle is the clerks, and a lot of people saying how this won't work. People aren't going to understand it, all stuff I'm sure you've heard, all the panelists have heard. So I finally worked out a deal with the clerks. I said, all right, just let us try this out. Just let us try it out at the municipal level as an option. If we can convince a city to do this, then let's let them do it. And let's see if what you're saying is right, or if what we're saying is right. Let's see if people can figure this out or not. So we got that bill passed finally, I believe in 2018. And then my work was cut out for me that summer because I had to travel around the state. And now I got to go tell all these city councils, hey, by the way, there's this other way that you can conduct your elections this year. And so I was all over the place. And we ended up getting 2 cities to opt into it. We would have had more, but if it wasn't for the county clerks that some of these other cities were in who refused to conduct the elections for these cities if they were going to do ranked choice voting. So we had 2 cities, the county clerk in Utah County in Utah. She's very forward thinking. She loves RCV, and was very willing to help us out with it. So got 2 cities, and they did it, and the results were great. I think they're both going to do it again. We had polling and exit polls and surveys that went out. The vast majority of the people just loved it. It was intuitive. You really didn't have to spend too much time explaining to them. They felt good about the process. And most people said they would like to use that process, in primaries and in general elections and at other levels. And so we have a bill this year in Utah that, and I think it'll pass, where we'll implement RCV at the primary for our primaries. And I would have ran the bill last year, but we have a big governor's race this year and some big congressional races. And we had 5 people on our primary ballot for the governor's race. And in one congressional district, I think we had 6 or 7. And the guy who won our congressional district won, I think he won with 37 or 42% of the vote, something like that. and the governor won with 46, something like that. And so a lot of people looked at that and said, yeah, this is a problem. We don't feel comfortable about this. We want a different way to do this, to get to um, a majority so we can get a broader feel of what the preferences of the people.
Yeah, not only that, it also gives like politicians um, a better way to govern, I think. And that's what I've observed here in the Bay Area. It's like when you have these like really close plurality splits, there tends to be like a perception that this politician might be vulnerable or is not really
Yeah.
representative. But when you have that, like, you run it down to 60% mandate, now you can actually get your agenda set and actually prioritize what you want to see be implemented in local government or state government, ideally. So I think actually there's a lot of interest there should be a lot of interest, and there has been a lot of interest here locally on like how do we frame these sorts of wins, because you tend to see how much more preferred a candidate will be when you actually get to see that ranking information at play. Um, I'm going to move on to Anna, and then we'll come back to you for the second set of questions. Anna, for many, the resilience of the Maine RCV campaign has been a beacon, both in terms of serving as a model of what is possible, but also in continuing to advance the reform despite strong opposition. What is some advice you want to give to people watching this about advancing democratic reforms, just in general? Just because we're thinking about what the next 2, 3, 4 years look like, and it would be really great to get some wisdom from you.
I have a few points that I think we've learned through the last couple of years. The first is that there is no better way to get people to understand and appreciate ranked choice voting than get them to use it. And that as voters start to use RCV, they start to realize that it's not anywhere near as complicated as it sounded when someone tried to explain it to them. It's a lot like things they do in their lives every day, and that as they use it in more elections, voters start to have the experience of like, in this election, it helped the candidate I wanted. In this election, it kind of didn't help the candidate I wanted. In this election, it really made no difference. And over time, it starts to become a little less about the impact on who wins and more about, well, in each of those elections, I had a better experience as a voter. I was able to make my genuine choices more easily. I didn't have to spend as much time fighting and arguing with people who mostly agree with me about who they should vote for to not be a spoiler. And over time, those differences, I think, start to build up. And so as we're moving into our third RCV heading into 2022, it's interesting to start to see how voters who are particularly independents, people who didn't have a strong an opinion moving in, it starts to become just part of the background landscape of elections. Younger voters, this is the only system that they've used for some of these races. So over time, we start to see it settle in. And for that reason, getting a foothold, I think, is so important. And it's something I recognize in Representative Roberts' story about Utah, and thinking about how important it's been for Maine to be able to have first the Portland mayor's race, then be able to have RCV be used in a series of primaries, then in a general election, then in more kinds of races. And so by the time in this past March, when we were asking Portland voters, did they want to expand ranked choice voting to our city council and school board, it just seemed like such an obvious, well, this is just some unfinished business. We're using it for everything else. I suppose we should use it for this too. So I've over time become a fan of that gradual approach. And I think the other piece that is important is that you need to be really clear about what problem are you solving with RCV. And there can be different answers to that, and it can depend on the community that you're in, the type of voter that you're talking to. But in Maine, we had a really strong sense that the problem we have is many 3- and 4-way elections with candidates who are spoilers and the winners not having the majority. And so RCV was a clear solution to that problem. In another community, it might be about RCV increasing representation of underrepresented groups, or it might be about the intensity of negative campaigning, or it might be about, aren't runoffs such a pain? So thinking about sort of what are the issues that that are bothering voters about the process, and how can RCV be a solution to those particular voters, and really tailoring the approach there. We've learned that you can never let your guard down. There's always going to be some procedural piece that you haven't thought of when you're running a campaign. The time after you've won an election is in some cases the most dangerous in terms of really getting it ingrained. But we've seen over time, town clerks are getting used to it. Our Secretary of State is getting used to it. We're seeing this gradual normalization of RCV in Maine, where it's not the new thing so much anymore. It can be a little bit just part of the background of how we do elections. And another thing, like our clean election system, like our same-day voter registration, we're sure there might be some opposition to it. There might be some people who are really proud of it, but most people just take it for granted as part of how elections work here. And for us, that will be success when it is something that is working in the background and making the system better.
When it's just like you don't even question it, it's just part of voting. Yeah, I live in San Francisco in the Bay Area. That's my second plug. I know that, and it has become that here. It's just like, oh yeah, it's a ranked choice voting election. Myrna Melgar won in District 7. That's not surprising because she wasn't the first round leader and ended up winning, and everyone's like, oh, okay, well that made sense. Okay. So it was really interesting. I want to move on to Professor LeVan and get back to you. Your 2018 poll found that GOP voters say having a majority winner is important. What were some of your other findings, and what are other questions we ought to be thinking about when asking voters about our democracy?
Sure. So our primary goal in the 2018 exit poll was to really see whether or not the critics' claims played out, right? So there were, like I mentioned, 3 overarching criticisms about ranked choice voting. One was that it would be too complicated. So we surveyed on that question. So an exit poll is, right, as people are leaving the polls, we're asking them about their experience. So we asked voters, how difficult was it? And I'm going to look at my numbers. 65% of respondents said very easy, 9% said easy. So, 3/4 of the people who had just used ranked choice voting for the first time were saying, yeah, it was pretty easy. And we disaggregated the data by both age and education level, and there were no differences. So everyone seemed to say it was pretty easy. So that didn't really play out in the actual experience. And so that's exactly what Anna was just saying. And then the question on the partisan ploy, which I already kind of talked a little bit about, did voters perceive this as some sort of, partisan issue? So we had asked voters about expanding. Do you want to expand? Because I don't know if the audience knows this, but in the state of Maine, we only use ranked choice voting for federal elections. So for the House, the Senate, and presidential elections, but we don't use it for state level. So to vote for governor or state legislators. And that's because the Maine Constitution explicitly states that there's a plurality rule requirement. So we don't use it yet. We would have to change the state constitution to implement ranked choice voting for state level offices. So the question we were asking was, well, would you support expanding? And basically respondents sort of echoed their partisan leanings, where Democrats overwhelmingly said, yes, we want to expand. Independents were about half and half. And overwhelmingly, Republicans were like, no, we want to get rid of it altogether. So again, when we went to that majority rule, it was very clear, right, as Pedro said, that everyone agreed that majority rule was very important. A majority of Democrats said that, independents and Republicans. So again, when we measure the value, voters supported the value behind ranked choice voting once we eliminated that partisan framing. So again, the idea that there was something partisan about it, people actually supported the value regardless of party ID. And then the last thing that we were looking at was this claim that voters weren't going to trust the results. And the reason critics said they weren't going to trust the result was because they said it was too complicated and that it was partisan. So everyone would think that it was it was unfair somehow. And again, because Maine has elections that are happening using ranked choice voting and then elections using that first past the post or the plurality rule, we had this opportunity to compare how voters felt, their confidence level in a ranked choice voting election and an election not using ranked choice voting. So in 2018, we had a federal Senate race using ranked choice voting and a governor's race that didn't use it. So voters in the exact same election were doing both simultaneously. And so what ended up happening was we were able to ask voters, how confident were you in the Senate race using ranked choice voting versus the governor's race not using? And what we found was that voters were more confident in the Senate race using ranked choice voting than they were in the governor's race that only had a plurality rule. So again, the critics' claims didn't seem to play out in 2018. And so that was largely, that was sort of our objective, was to see what happened in 2018. And there was very little evidence to support some of the criticisms about ranked choice voting. As to questions I think we need to be asking about democracies, sort of one specifically about ranked choice voting, and then sort of generally in our elections. My biggest worry about ranked choice voting would be some unintended consequences. So as I said earlier, voters don't have very much information. And when they make vote choices, they don't have a lot of information. And of course, ranked choice voting is asking voters to make a whole bunch of decisions. And again, they don't have very much information. So while most voters use party ID to cast a vote, that only gets you to your first ranking. And then we're asking them to rank second, third, and fourth. And so what I'm curious about is what information or how are voters deciding how to rank those? And my worry is that voters will rely on another information shortcut that we call heuristics, which are individual characteristics of the candidate. So a candidate's gender or a candidate's race or ethnicity, sexual orientation, something like that. And so I would worry that maybe voters might go, well, I'm a woman, so I'm looking for a female candidate, or I'm a man, so I'm going to look for a male candidate, and I don't want to vote for a woman. So I worry that an unintended consequence could be to that non-traditional, quote unquote, non-traditional candidates or candidates from marginalized groups might unintendedly be discriminated against. That being said, there are studies coming out of the Bay Area in particular that show that that is an overblown worry, that female candidates actually do better under ranked choice voting, that voters or candidates of color do better, that they are more likely to run and more likely to win, and that women of color in particular sort of win very big under ranked choice voting. I would like to see more evidence from places that aren't as diverse as the Bay Area. It's not that I don't think the Bay Area has sexism and racism. They do, it does. But it is also a much more diverse place. It's a sort of special little bubble. There aren't as many places like that around the country. So I would be interested to see what happens in a state like Utah or a state like Maine that is largely almost entirely all white. And so what happens when a candidate of color, a single candidate of color, is on the ballot? Do they get penalized? And so that would be a question I would be worried about. More generally, beyond ranked choice voting, something that I think political scientists are going to have to figure out how to measure when we're thinking about democracy is voters' perceptions of fraud versus voter suppression. So much like ranked choice voting in the state of Maine became politicized or became partisan issue, voter fraud and voter suppression, these ideas, these things, are also becoming politicized. So we have Republicans on a national stage sort of signaling to their voters that voter fraud is rampant and that it's dangerous and insidious, and we need to come up with a bunch of policy solutions to fix voter fraud. And then Democrats are denying that voter fraud may be happening. And so amongst the base, Republican voters are saying voter fraud, we need policies to stop voter fraud. And Democrats are saying, no, it doesn't happen, we don't need to worry about it. And then on the flip side, we have Democrats on a national stage saying voter suppression is happening, it's happening, everyone pay attention. And the Democratic base is saying we need policies to solve voter suppression. And then Republicans are rejecting the idea that voter suppression is happening. Now, I'm not trying to make a partisan claim, I'm just saying, I think it's dangerous that these two things are becoming politicized in this way. All Americans, regardless of party ID, should be worried about potential voter fraud when there's evidence that it's happening. And all Americans, regardless of party ID, should be very worried about voter suppression if it's happening and if there's evidence that it's happening. So I think political scientists need to figure out how we're going to ask voters whether or not they think voter fraud is happening but we can't use that language anymore because it's going to be just like ranked choice voting. We're just going to be measuring party ID, and the same thing with voter suppression. So going forward, I think that we need to figure out how we ask those questions to get at the core value, which is we don't want fraud if it's happening. And we definitely don't want voter suppression if it's happening. It is happening, but as a side note. But anyway, so that's just kind of where I'm thinking. The thing that I'm sort of looking at and wanting to figure out how do we measure this without just sort of picking up on party ID. And it is sort of disheartening that those two issues are becoming, I don't even know if issue is the right word, but that they have become politicized in this way. This is an issue of democracy, and Republicans and Democrats should really be on the same page when it comes to wanting to uphold the sanctity of our elections by preventing fraud, but also the sanctity of our elections by ensuring that every single eligible voter has access to the ballot box. So anyways, that's what I've been thinking about lately.
Yeah, and it makes me think about, a lot of these studies. I think it's important to really ask the questions like, what has been the RCV experience? What is it? How does it impact communities? How does it impact candidates? But I also think I would love to talk to you another time. There are things that I think aren't really well captured, which is like on your elections in San Francisco. Did you know that most of those offices are not subject to term limits, unlike the Board of Supervisors and the mayor, and that all of those offices are not publicly financed elections, except for we have public financing for the Board of Supervisors and the mayor, and that makes them more competitive and higher profile. So we should have a conversation sometime about that, because there are burdens that people don't really acknowledge in some of these elections as well. Representative Roberts, let's ask you this last question, and then we'll take a look at all these great questions we're getting from our audience. It is really lively, and it's really, really exciting. Given the polarized state of national politics, conservative support for ranked choice voting might surprise some watchers and listeners. However, several cities in Utah moved to adopt the reform after the passage of your bill. To me, that demonstrates that there is opportunity to have a genuine conversation about reform that is centered around a common set of values. What do you think are important elements to having a broader conversation about reform?
Yeah, I don't know that I have the silver bullet for this, but just some things that I've observed through the process. Some elements needed. I think you need to get the grassroots people involved. it's been hard doing this from the top down a little bit. And I really liked what Anna said, and absolutely agree with her that the slow approach is the best approach. I started this thing trying to, do this huge thing. We're just going to reform the entire state with ranked choice voting. Didn't get very far at all. But being able to, so one of the elements I think is if you can get down to the municipal levels, get people used to experiencing it, right? Once somebody experiences it and participates in it, the light bulb switches on. They're like, hey, this works. This is easy. I like this process. They're comfortable with it. And so then when you introduce it to them at a different level or a different place, it makes sense to them. And so I think that's where we've got in Utah now is, and one thing that's helped us get to where we are is we have so many people across the state within the Republican Party, which is a predominantly Republican state, right, that has experienced this. We've used it in our convention, our state convention. Many, caucuses use it. So they have experience with it. So when I go talk to cities and try to convince them to use it, a number of the city council members have done it before, right? They know how it works, and that's super helpful. So I think somehow we've got to figure out, and it's working in Utah. Start with these cities. Start somewhere so that people can experience it and taste it. Get it. If you can convince your parties to use it in caucuses and cities. So I think those are some good elements, just from what I've observed on how to continue the conversation. And then aside from that, it's, do we really feel comfortable or not with plurality situations, right? How comfortable are we really? We live in a representative democracy, right? And so ideally we want to get, 50 plus one, if at all possible, for those people who will be representing us on the political levels. I feel strongly about that. And that's really something I think Republicans can grab onto and feel strongly about it, especially as we're looking at, trying to get more Republican support on this. So anyway, those just some thoughts off the top of my head on different ways we can increase the conversation and how to reform this.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to say about, Carrie, your original kind of framing of this. I kind of took as like a greater thought and thread, like this idea that a majority should have a say, and that there is some good in having candidates that reach out beyond their base in order to represent a greater whole and have that mandate to govern, right? There's an efficiency aspect to that, and I have been very appreciative of everyone's very thoughtful input today. We have about 10 minutes left, and we have a lot of questions, and I just kind of want to dive in. I'll start with the first one that we have here marked for us. I would love to hear thoughts on overcoming GOP objections to RCV in states like Maine. I fear a legal challenge might have been mounted had it come into play. I will say there have been legal challenges mounted, and I think in large part those have been mostly exhausted at this point, like many of those legal arguments. But if any of our panelists have some thoughts about overcoming, I wouldn't even say they're just GOP objections. I would say objections generally at large, because I do think there is some opportunities to have conversations.
I'm just going to echo something real quick that Pedro just said that I think is important, that this isn't like Republicans don't like RCV and Democrats do. It's whatever party thinks they'll be advantaged by RCV like it, and the party that think they're going to be disadvantaged by it don't. So in Maine, we have a lot of independent candidates who tend to be left of the Democrat, and they split the liberal vote. But there are other states where there are libertarians running against and splitting the conservative votes. And so Democrats like that because they can win on a plurality. So it's really just about which party wants power and which one they think will be advantaged. So it shouldn't, that's why I keep saying it shouldn't be a partisan issue. It's about democracy and whether or not we think having a majority rule is important or not. Parties just want power, and so they're going to take a side in whichever direction advantages them. So I just want to put that little pin out there.
So Pedro, Carrie, I love what you said. I absolutely agree. And I think that's the bottom line. So to Sandy's question here, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you overcome GOP objections, right? And an interesting anecdote to Maine is I was at a national legislative convention shortly after Maine had conducted their first, you guys had done it the first time, right? And that Republican, and I don't know which district, had lost. And it was pretty controversial, right? This person, I think it was the incumbent, and had won a number of years in a row on a plurality. And now he was running, and there was, I think, 3 other people, and the Democrat won. It's the scenario you just described. So I didn't know what had happened. I didn't know what the results were. And I had a colleague, a friend of mine from Maine. He's a legislator at the state level in Maine. And so I saw him, and I was excited to ask him about how it went, what the experience was, because I knew they'd just done it. He was so upset about it. And he's a Republican, right? He was so upset. And again, I didn't know what had happened at this time. And so I said, well, what happened? Explain it to me. He said, well, we had so-and-so, he's been our congressman for so long. And then this person, the Democrat was running, and then we had 2 other people running, I think, and they were both left of the Democrat. And so when they did the ranking, the tallies, all the second place, choices went to the Democrat. And so the Democrat ended up winning, carrying the total over 50%. And so I looked at him, I'm like, so it worked then, right? And he was like, well, yeah, I guess, but Carrie, goes back to your point. It's at the end of the day, somehow we have to take off our logos, right? We're very tribal, and we just want power. And if we can just step back from that as partisan animals, and step back from that and say, what's the best for the people, right? The people who are being governed, and to get to the broadest idea of what their preference is for who they would like to represent them. That's what we should, if we're honest with ourselves, and if my GOP colleagues and my Democrat colleagues are honest with themselves, that's what we would get to. Now, in a state like Utah, it's interesting because we have the opposite thing happen. And I got to hand it to my Democrat colleagues in Utah, because it doesn't take much to look at these numbers and realize that you're kind of, as wearing the brand of a Democrat, shooting yourself in the foot. I'll give you an example. Our congressional district right now, they're still counting votes, trying to figure out who's going to win CD4 here. And Burgess Owens, a Republican, has 47.48%. Ben McAdams, the Democrat, the incumbent, has 46.94%. The Libertarian has 3.44 with 12,800 votes. And then there's this other person, I think independent, with 7,900. I think Joni is a little bit left-leaning. Well, if you were to do a ranked choice voting, most likely those 12,000 Libertarian votes, most of them are going to go to Burgess Owens, right? I'm just guessing. And so in Utah, it kind of benefits the GOP if you're going to look at it that way. But Carrie, you're absolutely right. But it's been nice working with my Democratic colleagues here in the state, because we've been able to take a step back and just say, hey, what's the best? Take off our logos. What's the best approach for the people, and to get the broadest preference of ideology, whoever's going to represent us. So to answer the question, I don't know how you overcome GOP or Democrat objections in different areas that may have them. You know, look at is it Massachusetts now, right? Large Democrat state. They didn't adopt it. I think people get stuck in their ways, and it's hard for them to look past that. And you know, that's really a larger partisan issue we have. That is another discussion. But I'll end with that.
Yeah,
it was a perfect counterexample with a state House race in Maine where we had a former Republican, now independent state representative who was the incumbent run against a Democrat and a Republican challenger. The Democrat had the plurality with just about 35% of the votes and is now the representative for an extremely conservative district in northern Maine that hadn't been represented by a Democrat since 1988.
This is at the state level?
At the state level.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I'm thinking that there are some Republicans in Dover Foxcroft who may have woken up the day after the election feeling a little more fondly toward RCV.
Sure. Yeah. Good example.
We have 2 minutes left. So there are a bunch of questions, and we'll try to type up some responses to these answers. I did want to mention, question 2 in Massachusetts, there will be some kind of postmortem analysis coming. I think it's a little early to kind of get like a good grasp of what happened in Massachusetts, but I would say that, you know, for folks eager to learn more about what's happened with some of the most recent ballot questions, stay updated and, you know, making sure you are following FairVote and getting our listserv. You could also follow Anna with the League of Women Voters in Maine. And I think everyone here is probably on Twitter. So, you know, you can kind of stay updated. And I want to express my gratitude to our panelists today for their really thoughtful discussions. And I thought we really were getting at something around what really should we be messaging and thinking about at voters and for our colleagues as well. It's like, is it best if, you know, does government work best when people are represented, right? And what does that mean? And I think we were getting at that, and I felt very encouraged. So we'll post the recording of this video onto YouTube by tomorrow morning. So I hope that you'll join us at future webinars. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you around.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.